And here we are, Sound Radio, and with us is James Davies. And you're from the Conservative Party, James.
I am, yes. Thank you for having me.
Oh, a pleasure.
No problem. Yeah,
pleasure.
It's been great to have all the different types of candidates on. We've had David Jones and Gavin.
Yeah.
Who else have we had, Paul? Oh, Glenn. Glenn's been in. Yeah, Glenn's been in.
Brexit Party, we've had...
Peter Dane,
yeah. Clive. So
it's good to have you on.
Yeah.
To put the Conservative viewpoint forward.
Yes.
Yes.
So, tell us a bit about yourself, because people become MPs and as though we'd like to know who you are and what you do and why you suddenly decided you wanted to move into politics.
Very good question, yes. Well, I remember back, the first election, I think it was 1987 when I was just 7, so I clearly had an interest in politics from a young age. And it wasn't a big feature, I suppose, in school days, but certainly when I left school, went to university, was something I increasingly picked up on, and it was interested in national politics, but also in the locality, actually, and especially Prestatyn at the time where I was brought up and looking around and thinking things could be better, and the two go together, of course, and also my late granddad, who was a solicitor in Rill, I think played a part. We used to go on walks around town every evening and talk politics as a teenager. So
was he a campaigner, an activist?
No, he wasn't. He just he was conservative-minded. It's not that he railroaded me into conservatism, but we just had discussions about the current affairs of the day, I think, and it went from there. At university, I was chairman of the Conservative Association, and then I finished my medical degree, and I came back to Prestatyn, and I stood for election only months later and got elected to the council, and that started 11 years of being a councillor for Denbighshire and Prestatyn Town Council. And of course then the 2015 election came forward, and I put myself forward. The party selected me, which was fantastic, and I squeaked in, as you know, and it's something that once you're involved with, it's very difficult to lose that interest, and so that's who I am, really.
And how about your family? Did they support you? Did they want you to move from your profession into politics?
Well, I mean, I don't think anyone has suggested to me it's a wise move in many respects, you know, financially or in terms of family time, and that is a big concern to me, I have to say. You know, it is tough if you've got a young family. But they've been very supportive, which I'm grateful for, and I just need to sometimes pull myself away and think, I could be doing this and that. In fact, there's never any end to what you can be doing in politics, and make time for family.
So how many children have you got? How old are they?
I've got 2, and they're ages 6 and 3. In fact, my younger was born while I was in Parliament, and it was at a time when there were important votes going on, and you know, there's no paternity leave, and so I would, you know, that was a strain as well, because you have to be down to vote, even if your wife's in Labour, in theory, which is not great.
So, as an MP, then, that's an interesting thing, is the paternity leave, because that became law, didn't it, legislation, only sort of in more recent years, and you know, something that I agree with, you know, for dads to be around as much as they can for the first few weeks. So, as an MP, that does not...
No, MPs are in a very funny category, in all sorts of respects, and you know, in fact, you're your own boss as well, so you employ your staff rather than them being given to you, for instance. But certainly from a workers' rights perspective, very few. Parliament is archaic in many ways, and if the whips need you there, they need you there, whether your leg's hanging off or you...
Are the whips fairly sort of tyrants? Could they limit your career?
Well, it depends which one you're
I have
talking about.
heard.
I mean, they're mostly normal people at the end of the day, and they do understand. But I think the issue in recent years is that there hasn't been a strong majority. Even when I was in, it was a fairly small majority. And so if you've got senior ministers off abroad on trips as ministers, then all the backbenchers are needed to ensure the government wins the day. So, yes, they will be pretty strict.
So, you're a Conservative. Why go for the Conservative Party?
It just fits with my general view on life, and it always has done, really. So I suppose all sorts of factors, really, but personal responsibility is one of them. A strong belief in the United Kingdom and traditions in this country that have served us well, and also freedom for the individual, so not a large state telling us what to do, but wherever possible, people making their own decisions in life.
It's quite traditionalist, isn't it? You know, the Conservative sort of viewpoint is very traditionalist. So do you feel that the Conservative Party could possibly do with moving into a more progressive era, really, rather than going back, maybe, as people might say?
I suppose it depends what issue you're looking at. I think the Conservative Party these days is quite socially liberal, and that transition really happened under Cameron in particular, that in terms of national leadership on that front.
Don't you think it's changing back a little bit to the more traditional type conservatism?
I've seen
that
that being
used to be?
alleged. I think some people conflate Brexit with being right-wing, whereas actually it's really not the case. I mean, knocking on doors, as I've done a lot of in the last few weeks, you see an awful lot of traditional Labour voters who voted Brexit.
And it's
not
cross-party.
about being left-wing or right-wing. So delivering Brexit is not a right-wing agenda, although admittedly some of those who've pushed it for many decades have perhaps been more on the right.
wing.
Sometimes, although it's
Because
also
you've
Dennis
always-
Skinner and...
You've
the rest
always
of
been against Europe, haven't you? From your voting in the past,
Well, if you'd asked me in 2015, and I wasn't asked, which is really odd, if you'd asked me, do I think we'll leave the EU or even should we, I'd have probably said no. To be perfectly honest, it was 2 years of campaigning to get in, listening to local views. I always thought that there were more important issues than talking about Europe continually. But we made a pledge to hold a referendum, which I thought was right because UKIP was gaining more and more ground. There was quite a lot of unhappiness, and it had been going on for years. And when that vote actually came, I sat down with like-minded people, I suppose, people my age, same kind of views and others. And I thought, we've always been reluctant members of the EU. That was my view. It was only going in the wrong direction in terms of further political integration, which we didn't really want, by and large, as a country. I also thought that there was a lack of democracy in that people would say, why don't you do this or that? And the answer from politicians often was, we can't because of Brussels. And so I think if we have...
Do you think that was a bit disingenuous at times, that they blame Brussels on a whole range of things?
Can you give
that
examples?
they did have controls.
Yeah, because what sort of examples can you give to that then? What sort of examples of restrictions would the United Kingdom have?
Well, I suppose control of immigration was a big one, or has been a big one.
How did they have control? We had freedom of
because of
movement in Europe,
Yeah.
but not outside in Europe. And we could also go to Europe and buy holiday, houses in Spain, France, Italy, all the warm countries.
Which we still will be able to, almost certainly.
But why was that was external immigration a big issue from the other parts of the world, America, South America?
Well, we've controlled that, of course, forever, haven't we? Non-EU
Exactly,
immigration.
yeah.
And many would argue that's been excessive or otherwise, and that's one point. I suppose once someone is within the EU, they then have freedom of movement, don't they? So there have been...
If they're a citizen of the European Union.
Well, yes, certainly if they're citizens, but even if they're not, it's very easy to get around, isn't it? And we've seen.
In
this.
Europe it is, but it's not easy to come over here because we're
that's why we
outside
get
of the
the,
Schengen.
In theory, not legally. No.
We get the deaths, don't we? Examples
Yes, exactly,
of people dying in the lorries and the deaths at sea
I'm
people
not,
are trying to.
Yeah, I'm not dead against immigration at all. I mean, there are many very hard-working people from Central and Eastern Europe in this country who we wouldn't be able to survive without. And actually, post-Brexit, we may want many of those people still to come here, but we'll have control over how many, I suppose, is the issue.
But I would suggest that the Conservative Party has been in power for 9 years now. Could have stopped all these things before from outside of the European Union, but they've failed to do that. They've said they want to, but they've failed to do it.
Yes, I mean, there are, of course, people that we need to come here, including for the
don't-
NHS, and that is a big part of it.
Well, I must admit, personally, I would like to see more diversity and immigration in Wales.
I think
But
this is something we mentioned before, haven't we? Is that is there enough diversity in North Wales? I mean, people are moving out now of North Wales. I feel that and we're not going to go on about Brexit, are we, for too much, because there's so many other issues to talk about, isn't there? But I do feel that, you know, especially with Betty's Cadwell, we've had so many staff just go back home because of the environment that the referendum has caused. So I think it was right that we should have the referendum. I think it was handled very badly. And since then, it's caused so much division.
It's caused division, as has the Scottish referendum. I think that ultimately...
It hasn't caused division in Wales, the Scottish referendum, has it?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, not much, no. I think, though, at the end of the day, we went into the European Common Market before I was born. There was a referendum then. There were increasing calls for us from people saying they'd gone too far. David Cameron tried to get a renegotiation. They didn't really understand the gravity of the public opinion here, didn't offer him much. People voted to leave. Now, I personally think we need to leave, and then we create connections and links with the EU that serve our
Can we
interests.
do that? On the World Trade Agreements, it will take another 10 years to do that, will it not?
Well, World Trade Agreements would apply if we left with no deal, wouldn't they?
But even if we left with a small deal, it would be very difficult. So.
Well, initially, of course, until the end of December of next year, there will be a transition period if the deal goes through before Christmas, which we hope, and therefore nothing will really change. It's what happens during that period in terms of negotiation of the trade agreement that matters, isn't it?
So
the future.
getting Brexit done is a bit of a red herring.
Well, there are
saying this for 3 years, isn't it? 3.5 years, get Brexit done. It's been a mess, hasn't it?
It's certainly a momentous change, but I think it's one that was inevitable sooner or later, and my feeling was we were better disentangling ourselves sooner rather than down the line when it would be even more difficult. So that's where I stand, and yes, there will always be ongoing negotiations with other countries and blocs. If you look at the EU currently, it doesn't have trade agreements with large parts of the world, so there's plenty of scope for more trade agreements around the world, but we need to focus on the key ones first, including the EU.
They take time, don't they? Any trade agreement is going to take a lot of negotiating, especially when we're negotiating with the likes of the Americans, because they have got a policy of America first,
They have, yes.
which, you know, that's up to them. But that does mean that Britain would go into a negotiation with America on the back foot, I think. I think they will have the upper hand.
Well, they are a very big, powerful country, and they will try to. Ultimately, there's no trade agreement with the US currently, so there's nothing to be lost by not having one. If there aren't suitable terms of agreement, then if necessary, we don't have one.
Fair enough. Can I just move on?
Domestic.
I was just thinking, as you were talking there, and it took me back to what you said straight away about personal responsibility. When you were an MP previously, you voted against people having more benefits. but I've got it all here.
Yeah.
Don't worry. You voted against increasing benefits. You voted against a whole range of things that would actually make it harder for people to live. Why did you do that?
Well, first of all, I'm aware of websites that claim to give you a summary of how an MP voted, but I would explain that you need to dig down into the precise votes and not necessarily believe the overall summary and what the agenda of that website is. So specific votes are important, and
I'm going from Hansard.
okay, fine.
Yeah, I think there's a parliamentary one, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm going from Hansard.
Yeah,
Not any of these other.
In terms of benefits, I was elected on a manifesto that said that there would be restraint on public spending because of the finances at the time, and that included on benefits. Now, one of the problems with looking at a summary of votes is that I might well vote to increase spending on an area as part of government policy, but then inevitably the opposition come along with an opposition day debate, a non-binding vote, and they say, well, that's all well and good, but we think you should increase it even more. And then I'm in a position, as are the whole of the MPs on the government side, where we have to vote against that because it doesn't fit in with the budget. And so it may appear then that I vote against increasing funding on something. But just coming back to benefits, as a doctor, I see people all the time from right across society, and I really strongly believe that those who have structure to their day, who have a job, the benefits that a job brings to their self-esteem are in such a stronger position than those on benefits. And one of the problems with the benefit system was that it had become a case that some people were...
when you say so, what percentage would you say?
Well,
some people, it's like sort of lots of people.
It's
some
difficult
people
to say, not the majority, but
No.
some people were not being pushed enough to do
small
what was in
a
their
small
interest.
percentage. What I'm trying to get is that is it something that was very prevalent around, or was it just 1 or 2%?
I think there's some people who don't realise what they're capable of, and so it's probably larger than you think. It's still I don't know, 10, 20%, let's say, as pulling a figure out of the air. But
So do you think with the universal credit then, with the rollout of that, what did you think to that? Because the UN rapporteur came and did an investigation in areas across the UK and came out with quite a damning report. You know, a very highly respected rapporteur of the UN, and he did condemn lots of the policies that had come from the Conservative Party around that time. One of them was universal credit. So,
well, universal
has
credit
it caused the problems, do you think?
I think like any major change in a system run by the state, there are problems, and no one had actually reformed the benefit system, partly because it was so difficult to do. But although you'll see currently in the election campaign other parties saying they'll get rid of universal credit, until very recently they've been unanimous really in supporting its general principles. It's really specific issues about delay of payments, for instance, which I accept.
So you
has been a
think
problem.
that there have been problems? Did you agree with the UN rapporteur's report?
No, I don't agree with
No?
that, and I think you'll find lots of people who don't either. And universal credit was not about saving money primarily; it was about making sure that work pays.
And the bedroom tax, I think, was one that was mentioned in the report.
Right, yeah.
Do
you agree with that bedroom
the
tax?
cuts to the disability benefits as well, I think, was mentioned. So
the spare room subsidy, as it is officially called. Well, I understand that.
Not in real and Towing.
I didn't actually know what the official policy
Obviously,
was.
the driver behind that, of course, is the fact that there are people living in social housing that is bigger than their families now are. Let's say if their families have moved out. And that therefore, if you've got people waiting on the social housing list who are struggling, are often maybe even homeless, there are homes available that could be used by them while moving those into smaller properties. The problem is there aren't any smaller properties.
Because there's a government policy, or Margaret Thatcher, I believe, in the 1980s, with the Right to Buy Act, the Housing Act at the time, didn't replace, and in that act that you couldn't replace council housing, and I don't think that's ever been repealed, has it?
It doesn't exist currently in Denbighshire, that's for sure.
Under the Welsh, because the housing devolved to Wales, isn't it?
Decided not to sell anymore. I think the right to buy at the time was good in terms of giving people aspiration, allowing people to move up in life.
Fine, but not replacing.
Well, there haven't been enough housing built under multiple governments for many years. Under Labour too, and of course housing has devolved in Wales anyway. So yes, there's more housing needed of all types in actual fact.
So you agree with council housing then?
Yes, yes I do, with social housing, of course, yeah.
Councils rather than, or
I don't
mixed?
I don't have any strong views. I think it should be a mix of provision, and also where people are able to own a share of the property, and that's even better because then they can get a foot on the housing ladder.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different schemes like that, isn't it? But it does go back to the fact that with the bedroom tax, shall we say, or what did you call it, sorry?
Spare room subsidy, yes.
Spare room subsidy.
Exactly
I'll start calling it a spare room subsidy now. I didn't realise that that's what it was called. But
I hate to say it, but if you go around the local area and say, what do you think of that?
No,
they won't have a clue what they're talking about.
No, I
basically, there wasn't housing to put. So people who may be in a large house that could be used for families, which is, fine. That's what it should be used for. But where can they go? And then they're being left with nowhere that they can go to, because this types of housing have been really short on the ground. All this housing lists. Thousands of people on the housing list. So where do they move people to? And that then has put them in a position where they're being punished because they can't literally go anywhere. It's it's caused a massive
there is a housing shortage nationally. It is a real problem. And that needs addressing, and all the parties, I think, are coming forward with proposals on that.
There was money put aside by the government for subsidised housing that wasn't used. Why do you think that was? I mean, a lot of money was put aside, big announcement, big sort of, we're putting all this money aside, none of it used. The Audit Commission said, great, but it hasn't been used in any way, shape or form.
Oh, that was on an interview the other day, wasn't it? About the Conservatives had said that they'd built 2,000, was it?
They
2,000 new homes, and not one had been built. Are you aware of that?
Well, that is in England. I try and have a focus on what's going on in North Wales. I would accept there haven't been enough houses built in England, but there haven't in Wales either. So all of those in power at various levels need to bear that in mind. And of course, there are continual debates locally about should we allow this or that development to take place, and it's often very controversial, and so.
Okay, I think moving
because
on from the housing issue, isn't it?
Don't you?
Do you live in Prestatyn? That's one of the questions, actually, from somebody that lives in Prestatyn. Do you live in Prestatyn?
Yes.
Are you based there?
Yes, between Prestatyn and also Chester, where my wife has family. And
where's your main house? Where's your main?
Prestatyn.
It's how? It's Prestatyn. Yes. So your wife and your children live in Prestatyn with you?
Well, some of the time, yes. It's a very complicated setup. It's not easy, but that's how we managed to sort it out, essentially.
So you go between
that's right,
the
yes.
Chester property and your Prestatyn property, then?
Yep.
That was one of the questions that came through. Am I all right just
yes,
going
carry
through
on,
a couple
carry on,
of the
yeah,
questions then? And we've had quite a big response, James.
Really? Yeah.
Yes. I think we've talked about voting records. That was one. A couple of people actually had mentioned voting records. A couple of people had mentioned the universal credit, the cuts with the DWP cuts, with the disability benefits. Did you agree? Did you vote for them?
The work-related activity group.
I'm not sure
Yes.
what it was. Was it the £30 a week cut to the
not to
ESA?
existing
Is that
claimants,
right?
was it? It was for new claimants of work-related activity group, that they would receive less than those on the support group. So the support group are those who are not in a position to consider work. Work-related activity group are those who, by its name, are essentially able to to move towards work over the course of time. So the idea behind that was really to help people into work, or to make work pay.
Did you agree with how the assessments were being carried out?
Well, that is my key issue, yes. I mean, as an MP and as a GP as well, actually, I have not been happy with some of the assessments for PIP in particular, and a lot of my time as MP was spent in assisting people with that and trying to get their cases seen again. And there were multiple opportunities, or multiple instances where people were not being given a fair hearing, really. So I met with DWP officials as an MP and brought forward a multitude of cases that showed failings, and they agreed that that was the case, and I suggested that they be recorded. Well, in those cases they did. Yes,
because there was, like you say, there's many instances, hasn't there, been reported about the assessment process, which I think was one of the biggest issues that people had because of the unfairness of the assessment process, which was brought in by the Conservative government that you voted, didn't you, for at the time of the policy, when the policy came out and all the changes to the reforms to the benefit system were being rolled out. The things that you did vote for initially, although you did find after that the process
I think the
was
assessment
not
processes
really
actually
working.
were brought in under the previous government. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they haven't always been fit for purpose, and as far as I was concerned, I needed to correct the balance and try and make sure that anyone who contacted me got a fair hearing, and we were very successful on that front.
It seems a very expensive way of doing things, doesn't it?
Because it's basically been outsourced from the medical services, outside of the medical services, to people who are basically have had 6 weeks training, which is absolutely horrendous for people who are literally, going through some really bad, tough times,
no, I
physically or
completely
mentally.
agree, and I was very clear in my
terrible.
letters of support for people about this, and have been as a GP too, and that is one of the reasons why you elect politicians, really, to fight your corner, there we go.
I think policy-wise as well, though, you've got to upset with policy because you're voting for a wide policy that's going to be rolled out across the country. So we all have to, if you're an MP, each one has to take responsibility for what they actually do vote for. Just we've got one here about the Iraq War. Why did you vote against an investigation into the Iraq War? I don't know. I haven't seen that. Did you vote against
I can see it here. Yes, there was it was the Iraq War. You voted against an investigation into it, presumably about officers who'd done things wrong, the soldiers who'd done things wrong. You voted against any further investigation into it.
Did you?
Well, yes, I evidently did. Into investigation into officers who were accused of having done things wrong. Yes. I think there was a widespread feeling that officers were being unfairly treated, really, in relation to carrying out their duties.
So how do you feel about sort of Northern Ireland and investigations going on about civil rights abuses? And do you feel that the army, wherever it is, should not be accountable for any human rights atrocities?
Oh, well, yes, of course it should be for human rights atrocities, but in terms of Northern Ireland, I am uncomfortable as well about that, yes, where those who were carrying out their duties down the line are then being threatened by action.
But if someone has... I mean, the same's happened in all wars. People will say, I was told to do this and I just did it. and yet you do have things, people on the front saying, well, actually, when people came towards us, we would sort of make sure they didn't come forward by chopping the fingers off with the visors and things like that. They would do things that were above and beyond what their orders were.
So what was this, in Iraq? Or?
No, there's different. There's different. I think in general,
going back to the Second World War. I mean, obviously, it's about being sensible, I think, and pragmatic. You can't give a clear-cut approach to these things. But whichever side, if they've committed atrocities, that is an international outrage and needs to be properly looked into. But at the same time, we don't want to. To be attacking our own troops who are trying to do the right thing.
But I think the governments who send people into these wars have a massive responsibility, and I don't think that the governments are held to account, whichever governments they are, and in the UK but across the world as well. They've got huge responsibility towards their soldiers and their armed forces, and they send people into these wars that turn out to be not what they're supposed to be and what they're claimed to be. So although the individuals in the services themselves, I mean, how do you hold the individuals to account, but also the governments to account for what's gone on?
I don't think there's one way to do it. I think it depends on the circumstances, but I certainly wouldn't want to stifle proper investigation into atrocities.
Because you've consistently voted for military action in the Middle East. You've consistently voted for Trident and those types of things.
I'm not a warmonger. I strongly believe that we need Trident. We need a nuclear deterrent, unfortunately, in this day and age. I'd love us to get rid of nuclear weapons, but we can't unilaterally. So that's where I stand on that. In terms of the Middle East, my only real input was over very defined airstrikes in Syria, which was very controversial at the time, but actually when you were looking at ISIS at the time, of course, they didn't respect countries' borders, and so the Parliament had the authority, or the government had the authority to target them in Iraq, but not if they crossed over into Syria, and that was an international danger.
Can I ask what your views are on about things like Kashmir that's happening now, and issues in other parts of the world where we've decided not to take action? I'm thinking of the Chinese issue with the Muslims in the sort of northern China. Kashmir is a big issue, which the UK set up to fail many years ago. What are your views on these things?
Well, I think it's often easy to look back in retrospect and think we should have intervened. I mean, as your original question suggested, there's a lot of pressure over things that we have done already, and should we be intervening in every case? There are instances where we should have intervened and haven't, probably, but equally the other way round. I think it's a really difficult judgment.
Do you think we're sort of, the UK think of themselves collectively as peacemakers in the world, because we seem to cause more problems in these countries than what we actually resolve. I mean, you look at Iraq now. I mean, years and years and years of issues that Iraq and the Iraqi people have faced because of the decision that we made as a country to go to war. The same as Syria. We've been there, and we've had military action there. I mean, is this a way of causing peace? I just don't get it.
I think you need to. It's just where you start the story, isn't it? Really, because there were some who'd argue that Iraq as a country was never a sensible idea anyway, and in terms of its boundaries. I think what we don't know is if we hadn't intervened, what would have happened then, do we? At the end of the day, there was some very brutal people in all of these countries doing very bad things to their own people and to their neighbours often, and you can't necessarily sit back, and we don't want to.
Put my seat down. Sorry, James. I just realised I pulled the wrong chair out. We had this problem with David Jones the other day, but I could put my chair down as well.
All
But
right. Have we got all chairs that sink under the weight?
Well, this one
This one's not, but James's is, and I can't actually do anything with mine, so I do apologise. It's only about 15 minutes left now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, so just to move on to maybe one or two more before we finish.
From my fans, I can tell these.
Fans, Annie, do you know Annie Barch, Dr Davies? How does your public documented voting against the industrial action by the junior doctors help to stem the ongoing decimation of the NHS and detory austerity?
Yeah, it'd be good to move on to the health now.
I
Yeah.
think,
Yes, that's very unbiased,
we're
that
looking,
question.
we're
She's a
looking
friend,
at the
she's a friend of
NHS,
yours,
aren't
is
we? I've asked, these are just the questions that are actually coming in, and we
Yeah.
did.
As far as the junior doctor strike went, I spent quite a long time thinking I could try and broker something on that, perhaps foolishly, but met the senior people from the BMA who virtually admitted privately that they'd gone too far and they were finding it difficult to back out of it. I did actually abstain on some of the votes on that in solidarity with my doctor colleagues. But some of what was being fed to doctors was simply not true about what the changes involved. So it wasn't clear-cut. And that question goes on to talking about the NHS. Well, I have to say that since the 2017 election, I've worked as a GP in Rill in 2 practices, and also in Holywell and Ellesmere Port and Chester, and I look at the provision of the health service in North Wales, which is obviously overseen by Labour, and it's actually in a very, very poor state, and people are being let down. And you have to bear in mind that expenditure on the NHS in Wales is basically no different to England. The money comes from the Treasury. In fact, for every pound spent in England, Wales gets £1.20. So for the same expenditure, the outcomes are woeful, and people are waiting far much longer in North Wales for treatment and for access to health services.
Is the budget from Westminster now coming into Wales, is it sufficient? Because it's per head of population, isn't it? I'm not sure what the figures are. I don't know.
No, I don't know, but it's based on the Barnett formula, isn't it?
Formula.
Yeah.
So do you think that's sufficient coming in from Westminster to actually cover, rather than per head, not sort of the need? So if you imagine, especially our constituency along North Wales coast, I mean, we have elderly retirees and,
From England.
Yeah.
And Wales.
Did I actually
And
say that?
England and Wales.
British, yeah.
British people, and whoever they are, it doesn't matter to me. Whoever is in need of care and social care, then we need to be looking at providing it. So, would you say that that formula doesn't work then for Wales because of its demographic?
Well, the Barnett formula was meant to address that, but I was concerned that it wasn't giving Wales a fair deal, and so it was amended actually a few years ago. And most people regard the deal that was done on that front, the funding floor formula, to have been acceptable. Having said that, of course, there's never enough money, is there, for everything? I think the key thing though is not just how much money is coming through, which is just as much as for similar communities in England, if not more.
Sufficient.
Well, you could say that, as I say, about any area.
Can I ask, would you argue for more money to come into the area for health?
Well, yes. I mean, actually, as a Health Select Committee member, I did argue for more spending.
And what sort of extra funding would you want to come in to North Wales?
Well, we're talking to sort it out. We're talking a lot of money.
How much?
Well,
I like specifics.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I think at the moment it's not in a fit state just to have money thrown at it. The main issue is the way it's organised and run. To be perfectly honest, you could throw money and it would provide some respite, perhaps, but a lot of the problems are ones that are developed over a good 20 years of bad decisions.
So what would you say is needed in your constituency to fix it?
Well, I have a very long list here from my experiences working as a GP, but essentially the whole system is failing, and it comes down to all sorts of things like IT systems, which have been upgraded in England, and Wales has not taken part in that, tried to do their own thing and failed. Contracts which don't require the hospital to do certain things. And
you haven't said more GPs,
local
you haven't said more nurses. Would they help?
Well, they would, but you have to. The issue with workforce in North Wales is partly the fact that it's not being seen as an attractive place for people to work, because the system's underperforming and there's more risk, essentially. And so you need to sort out the underlying things to actually make it a place where people want to work.
Do you think people were working? I mean, I don't know what the figures are of people moving out of the staff being lost from Betty's Cadw, from the European Union, and then going home because of the atmosphere that's been caused because of the referendum. You know, there's been so much stupidness around what the decision was either way. So, I mean, I've heard that a third of the staff were Europeans that actually went home. Is that correct?
I don't think there's been anywhere near that loss.
Not a massive loss.
I mean, I looked into this again on the Health Select Committee, and there were concerns on that front. But and certainly there are a lot of foreign nationals working within the NHS.
And they are being lost.
Well, in small numbers, but I don't think there hasn't been a large loss.
But you don't think staffing is a big...
No, staffing certainly is an issue. Yes, there's a huge shortage of doctors and nurses, and that is part of the problem. And therefore, it's a vicious circle, I'm afraid. Yes, we need more doctors. We need more GPs so that people don't turn up at A&E. We need to be able to provide out-of-hours bookable appointments as per in England so that people don't go to A&E. There's a multitude of things, and the whole thing is grinding to a halt. You know, people are waiting 3 times longer for outpatient appointments than in England. A&E waiting times in Clwyd are some of the worst in the UK. And
would you sack the members of staff who organise it, the chief executives and the trust?
I wouldn't sack them all, no. I think...
what would you do with them? Because
I think one of the problems...
Their job is to fix it, isn't it?
One of the
make
problems,
it work.
I think, in North Wales is Betsy Cadwallader is a very large area. Although it doesn't contain that many residents, it's geographically large, and the difference between North West Wales and North East Wales is quite significant. And Clwyd used to perform well when it had its own team of management that had pride in the hospital and got their hands dirty.
When was this? How long ago?
Well, I think it was probably a good 15 years ago, wasn't it, really, when Clwyd was in some of the top UK performing hospitals. It now doesn't come anywhere near.
Why don't you think the current management are to fail?
Well, I know they're trying their best, but I think partly the local or regional structures are to blame. But they're also working within the constraints of Welsh health policy, and let's pretend England doesn't exist and we do everything ourselves, except they haven't got the expertise or the capacity.
Do you like the Welsh health policy in the sense that it reaches closer to the 1945 original NHS Act, where there's free at the point of need, whereas in England that's changed in the 2012 Act. There is no longer a list of legal responsible by the government. There's no list of procedures that they're legally responsible for. Whereas in Wales, they've kept that, and they've kept free
they've been ideological, that's true.
And things like that. So with the free prescriptions, so that's one example, isn't it, of how they've kept.
Yeah, I think in Wales they've been too ideological and just assumed that because they thought that they were had the interest of the NHS at heart, which undoubtedly they do, that everything would be fine. But they haven't reformed it. They didn't even take on board the Labour UK, reforms under Blair. So that is part of the problem. That when I look around the NHS North Wales, often I see something that hasn't really changed markedly in the 20 years that devolution has existed. So,
do you think more of it should be privatised?
No, I don't think it should be privatised. I'm very cross, actually, that every election Labour bring forward this. The Conservatives will privatise the NHS because there's no evidence of that.
GPs and dentists and opticians should be in the private sector?
Well, they're not sort of in the private sector, but they run their own businesses within the NHS, I suppose, in that respect. Yeah, I think that works well.
You're outside of IR35 and HMRC sort of rules and that. So you are an independent private doctor working for the NHS.
Well, you're not a private doctor. It depends on terminology. I don't have an ideological bar to systems such as that existing within the NHS, which they have from its inception. I think the key point for me is that it should be funded by the taxpayer and be free at the point of delivery.
Can I ask
Teeth
then,
and
sorry,
eyes aren't, are they?
the prescriptions?
Sorry.
Firing questions. I just wanted to sort of... so prescription charges then, which was mentioned. Do you agree that with Wales's policy not to charge for medications?
I think the problem with Wales's policy is that it encourages people to seek prescriptions for things like paracetamol, which could and should be bought over the counter, and that takes up appointment time.
I think that's stopped now, hasn't it?
Well, it still happens.
Paracetamol.
It still happens to a degree, and a multitude of other drugs that could be remedied in other ways. So there is that aspect to it, and there are people who can afford to pay for prescriptions who are getting them for free, which is not a great situation when you've got such problems in the NHS. However, there are occasionally, yes, the working poor who I see who may not be inclined to get a prescription dispensed because of the attached cost.
So you agree maybe more with the English model that?
Well, I think the English model is outdated as well.
They're actually charging, aren't they?
The English model still relies on people having one of a number of conditions, which is quite archaic. Of course, in England, actually, a vast majority of prescriptions are free anyway, because mostly they're for people of retirement age or on benefits or with one of those chronic diseases.
So just moving on, and I'm just going to, because there's just one particular question, and it was around immigration and about a vote in 2016. Voted against.
People seem to know you better than you do.
They know you well, James.
Well, it's a marginal seat, so I get very. Yes, there's plenty of scrutiny. That's plenty
of scrutiny, and to be fair, David Jones has and Peter Dane, with his Brexit policies, people have had lots of questions for people, and so just get this clear. April 2016, the government voted against Lord's Amendment 87. Of the immigration bill. Now, this would have granted refuge to unaccompanied Syrian children fleeing the war, but was refused on the grounds that it would incur a charge on public funds. So they're asking, Danny is asking, were you not there for that vote? Did you abstain, or...
I think there were multiple votes on refugees while I was there. Actually, I presume I didn't vote in that. If that's what that's suggesting.
Your name did not appear on the register of ayes or noes.
Okay, so presumably I was.
Whether you were paired with another MP. I've never heard of this.
Have you got a good memory?
I can't. But. What I would say was that the general thrust was that we needed to accept our fair share of child refugees, and there was concern that if they're entering the EU and quite a long way away, Greece or elsewhere, that it shouldn't be the case that the United Kingdom takes more than its fair share, bearing in mind that they are travelling through multiple other countries on the way. So it's about having a balance and making sure that every country plays a part.
So do you think we took enough refugees in, considering that it was our airstrikes that are actually, you know, not just our airstrikes, but there's, I think there's been like
ISIS, maybe.
There's there was 4 elements there, wasn't there? You had ISIS, you had America, you had UK, and you had Turkey and Russia as well. They were all they were all involved in this destruction of this country. So, you know, we have to take responsibility as well. And do you think we took enough refugees in there?
Well, I think that the country, the government, did its best to accept what was a fair number. I don't know the final number that came. I know that there were some that came to Rhyl because I inquired and I was taking an interest in their well-being, and I know that, for instance, the healthcare and so forth. So this area played its part, and as did the whole country, and there was opposition to that from some quarters, but we have to do what's right. However, we can't have an open door for whoever wants to come. That's just the reality.
Can I ask
5 minutes of James.
Can I ask 2 more questions? One, and these were things that have come up. Do you agree with fox hunting?
I agree with the retention of the Fox Hunting Act as it stands. I wouldn't see any changes. I haven't been fox hunting myself, wouldn't want to do so. I respect both sides of the debate in reality, and I accept that there are, I don't agree with animal cruelty, and I'm pleased actually that the Conservatives have brought through multiple policies on that.
So you wouldn't vote to repeal that then, because there has been talk, hasn't there, within certain elements of the Conservative Party the last year or two, in regards to repealing the Act.
Well, there are those with different views. I don't think it's in the manifesto. Okay.
So last question from me, and again another one that's come up. Do you follow your party line on issues, or would you follow your constituents' line on issues? And can people trust you as a person?
Right, okay.
Feel free to say no to the last bit, but go on.
Well, I fundamentally would do what I feel is right. An MP isn't there to always vote with their party or to always do what is flavour of the month at the time. They have to make their decision based on weighing a number of things and bearing in mind what they've been elected on. So, I mean, for instance, in the EU referendum, you could argue I went against the leadership. Well, I did. I supported Leave, so that's one side of things. If I feel strongly about something, I will say it.
Even if it's against your constituents? If they voted you in and you believe something against the welfare of your constituents and the views of your constituents, would you, if they all suddenly said, we want to stay in the European Union, what would you do?
Well, that's a particularly difficult issue, isn't it? I mean, this area did vote to leave. I think you have to implement the will.
But in the future, because this has gone on.
I think, as I say, it depends on the issue and weighing up multiple factors. I certainly don't want to be going against the strong views or interests of the area, no. And in terms of can people trust me, well, yes, they can, and they, despite what they may read online or elsewhere, and they
are welcome elsewhere
to come and you're welcome to come
what's
talk to me.
Going on?
Oh, well, I don't know. Hopefully nothing.
We haven't read those.
They're welcome to come and meet me and realise that I'm a normal person and do have the area's interests at heart. And fundamentally, you know, when I lost last time, which was obviously as part of an unsuccessful national campaign largely, although my vote did go up 3,000, it was still not enough, and I lost. That was a big hit, and many people said, well, if you want to stay in politics, go and find a safe seat. And fundamentally for me, that's not what I want to do, and that's why I'm standing here again. I was born in St Asaph, and this is my home area, the area I have an interest in, and I wouldn't want to represent anywhere else.
So did you, in 2017 when you lost your seat, did you go back to full-time work?
Yes,
as a doctor,
yeah, well,
then?
I had to, yes.
A GP?
Yeah, but and
Yeah.
happily so, and it's been a real eye-opener working in different places, and I've enjoyed it. But I've invested a lot of time in the area, and it's something I have an interest in and want to do my best for, and so while the opportunity may be there, I'm keen to have a go.
Is that your final word? Anything more to add?
Would you like to add anything about voting for yourself?
Well,
James?
just to thank everyone I've spoken to on the doors. There's been an awful lot of support. I don't know which way it's going to go, of course, but people have been very kind, and please, yes, do have faith in me. I will always endeavour to do my best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in, James.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for choosing to listen to your
Sound
local
Radio
community
Wales.
radio
It's a
station.